Just before we begin today's episode of The Daily, we would love to hear your thoughts on the podcast we do here at Sky News. So we have put together a short survey, which you can find in the audio tab on the Sky News app. It will, I promise, only take a couple of minutes of your time, and we are very grateful for all the feedback we will receive. Thanks very much for listening. Even before the allegations, Russell Brand divided opinion. To some, he was a rakish charmer, possessed of a quick wit and a quicker libido, bringing and articulating grand ideas to a constituency usually disaffected by politics. To others, he's a conspiracy theorist and COVID denier, an overexcitable man-child who departed the BBC after leaving answer phone messages for Fawlty Towers actor Andrew Sachs, telling him he'd slept with his granddaughter. The stand-up comedian turned wellness guru is accused by 4 women of rape, sexual assault and emotional abuse between 2006 and 2013. Brand denies all the allegations made against him and says all his sexual relationships have been entirely consensual. The reporting by journalists from The Times, Sunday Times and Channel 4's Dispatches documentary programme has already led more women to come forward, claiming they were ill-treated by Brand. One charity, Trevi Women, which works with mothers recovering from drug addiction, has said it will no longer work with him. The Metropolitan Police are also examining the allegations, which we learned just minutes before publishing this podcast, now include a fresh complaint of sexual assault in London in 2003. I'm Niall Paterson, and on this edition of The Daily, we'll look in depth at the allegations and the years spent on the reporting that put them in the public domain. In a moment, I'll be speaking to one of the journalists responsible for the story. But first, let's listen to Russell Brand's response.
Amidst this litany of astonishing, rather baroque attacks are some very serious allegations that I absolutely refute.
OK, so let's turn our attention to the allegations themselves. Before we do, just a warning, we will be discussing the details of claims of sexual assault and rape. Paul Morgan-Bentley is Head of Investigations at The Times. Paul, for the uninitiated, just who is Russell Brand?
Russell Brand is a comedian, he's an actor, and more recently, he's a big online influencer with, the estimation is about 25 million followers online. But he's managed kind of through reinvention to stay really at the centre of celebrity showbiz life. In the UK and America since the beginning of the early 2000s, basically. He's known for saying extreme things, for talking very openly about a history of drug addiction, and then while he was in recovery, replacing that with sex addiction. He was there were kind of jokes about in the 2000s about how many women he had slept with. He was given the title Shagger of the Year repeatedly by the Sun newspaper, and audiences kind of laughed along when he told his jokes about his sex life and extreme things to do with sex. And I think, for a long time, he kind of pushed those boundaries. But what this investigation that we've been working on for some time now is showing is that there are allegations from women that are that go into potential criminality. The allegations are very, very serious.
Let's go through the allegations that we have, and they relate to accusations of rape, sexual assault and emotional abuse between 2006 and 2013. Shall we start with Alice, the name given to the 16-year-old that you were speaking to?
Alice was 16 when she met Russell Brand. He was 30 at the time. They met in Leicester Square. She'd been out shopping and he spotted her and kind of went through her shopping bags. I should say these are her allegations. This is her account of what happened. And then they began eventually a relationship, which she says lasted for about 3 months. Her descriptions during the relationship of what happened to her, her claims during that period are, really sound like emotional abuse and controlling behaviour. She talks about Russell Brand asking her to stay in a bath for an hour while he went out. He asked her to change his name in her phone to Carly so that her parents wouldn't know that she was texting him. And then she also talks about one specific allegation of sexual assault in which she says she was sitting up in bed, and he forced his penis down her throat, making her choke, and that he only got off her when she punched him in the stomach, and that afterwards he kind of pinned her down on the bed and drooled in her mouth. And it's all really kind of shocking to hear. But her allegations are obviously extremely serious, and that was actually in 2006, at the time when he was a BBC radio presenter doing those stand-up shows and talking about these types of things, talking about how he liked it when sexual activity became, he makes a joke about women choking during oral sex, although he makes it very clear in his stand-up show that only if she suggests it and things like that. But then her account details what she says happens when she very much didn't suggest it.
Russell Brand denies the allegations and makes it clear in his mind that everything that he did was entirely consensual. Let's talk about the second woman, the second woman and her allegations, a businesswoman who met up with Russell Brand in 2012.
Yes, so her allegation is that she met Russell Brand after he'd moved to Los Angeles. It was 2012, and she went to see him in a kind of pilot show that he was doing out there, and they met at an after party. And she talks about her allegation is that he made a beeline for her and kissed her, and they swapped numbers. And they met up once, and they had consensual sex, and they were texting back and forth. But then she says in July 2012, he got in touch with her quite late at night, and she says that she went over to his house, and the door was unlocked, and she walked in, and he was naked. And he then says to her, her allegation is that he then said that he wanted her to have a threesome, and that there was already another woman in the house, and she refused, and that Brand then raped her up against a wall in his home in LA. She also has text messages between them after she left his house that evening, and it's quite clear in the text messages how he's apologetic, and then she sent him a long text message saying that she felt taken advantage of and that no means no, and he replied again saying he was really sorry. And then also she went that same day to a rape crisis centre, and after we got in touch with her, she requested the notes from the centre, which we've gone through as well.
Again, Russell Brand denies the allegations and says that all sexual encounters were entirely consensual. There are also allegations from someone who in fact used to work for Russell Brand, someone that he met in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting.
Yes, so this woman, we've called her Phoebe, and I should say we're protecting the identities of these women who have chosen to remain anonymous. And the woman we're calling Phoebe alleges that, yes, they met at an AA meeting in Los Angeles, that in 2013 she was working in a kind of team around him, and that work involved working kind of in various locations, including at his house sometimes. And on one occasion, she says he pinned her down on a bed in his house and tried to have sex with her, and she had to kind of fight him off, which she describes as a sexual assault as well.
Again, Russell Brand denies the allegations. One name that we can mention, though, Jordan Martin, someone who was in a relationship briefly with Russell Brand, made allegations in a book that she herself published. What has Jordan been saying?
Well, Jordan didn't want to kind of formally take part in our investigation for personal family reasons at the moment. But she did publish this book, and she was happy to confirm that she stood by all the allegations. And in this book, she kind of gives herself and Russell Brand pseudonyms, but makes clear that it is about their relationship. And she describes what sounds a lot like emotional abuse controlling behavior during this relationship they had, and including an allegation of sexual assault that happened in a hotel in Manchester.
And again, Russell Brand denies the allegations, although we should note that these allegations were published with names changed in a book, and as far as I'm aware, that book has not had any legal action against it. There are also a number of complaints and questions around Russell Brand and his professional conduct, the way in which he interacted with audience members and indeed staff on the various programme strands that he was involved in. Tell us a little bit.
So some of the women that we've spoken to worked on productions for Channel 4, earlier in their careers, when Russell Brand was really rising to fame as the host of what was initially a program called E-Forum and then became Big Brother's Big Mouth. And we've spoken to different sources on who worked on those productions, and they make allegations that Brand at the time as the presenter would get runners to approach female audience members, so he could meet them afterwards. One says she remembers phone calls from the audience members afterwards who had her number because her job was recruiting audience members, and that they were very upset after they'd met with Russell Brand. A different former runner makes an allegation that she went into his changing room once and he flashed his penis at her, and that that took her by surprise, and she then left the room later. But actually she goes on to say how he was very charming towards her and they started a sexual relationship as well. And she says that he told her that she couldn't tell anyone about this relationship because in his contract, he was banned from having sex with other people on the production. As it turns out, the production company says no clause like that was in his contract. But she remembers him saying that to her as a means, I guess, she alleges, to keep her quiet. And now reflecting on that experience, she talks about how he was the star on the show and she was a very junior runner. And she didn't feel like she could tell anyone about it. And she feels like there was a real abuse of power there.
And again, Russell Brand denies the allegations. Look, I suppose the question one has to ask at this point, and indeed it is a question being asked by, in inverted commas, supporters of Russell Brand, is why now? Why at this point does this investigation move into the public domain?
I mean, something that I should say is that these are not women who have come together and suddenly emailed the Times and said, we want you to tell our stories about Russell Brand. Lots of people, I think, across the industry, across the media industry, have heard rumours about Russell Brand's behaviour or alleged mistreatment of women over the years. And there was some talk of there being a predator called out, a predator in inverted commas, on a comedy show a few years ago, and who that might be. And we started looking into Russell Brand's treatment of women and speaking to people who have had relationships with him, people who have worked around him. And it was only through those inquiries that eventually, through source putting in touch with a friend who then, that was the process. And eventually we met these different women. And like you said, there are 4 women who have made serious allegations of sexual assault. And then also there's a number of other women who have made lots of allegations about his behavior, very worrying things as well. These are women that we then approached, and for different reasons they hadn't come forward previously, is what they say. In Alice's case, who was 16 at the time, she talks about growing up and realizing what happened to her and now seeing it as grooming. And as a 16-year-old who was a virgin at the time, she talks about how she felt like he was the kind of grown-up in the room. She actually, in Alice's case in 2020, she got in touch with Tavistock Wood, the literary agency that represented Brand, to tell them about her allegations. At the time, after she did this, she got a legal letter, a very aggressive legal letter. When we went to Tavistock Wood with the fresh allegations, they have now dropped Russell Brand and said they felt misled by him in the past. So they're no longer representing him. So she has tried to come forward in the past without talking to the press. And lots of people have made comments about these women that I've seen online, saying things like, well, why don't you go to the police? And, there is a real conversation to be had about that in terms of the criminal justice system and how it fails women. You just have to look at conviction rates to see how women who do go to the police straight after they are allegedly attacked, how rare it is for that to result in a conviction. And so in these cases, for their own personal reasons, they didn't go to the police at the time. And we'll have to see what happens kind of going forward in that regard.
I mean, Marion Jones, a name I'm sure you'll recognise, the producer, the former Newsnight producer whose work on Jimmy Savile really brought that into the public consciousness. I mean, he said that there is a wider problem here, that abusers are taking advantage of UK libel laws. I mean, is that your experience?
It's incredibly difficult to report on cases like this. As a journalist, as an investigative reporter, one of the big hurdles is obviously if you're planning on reporting on someone who has a lot of money, they're going to get the best lawyers and they're going to try by any means to get things out of the public sphere. And, you know, people have a right not to be libeled, and journalism has to be responsible. But of course, there's an inequality there in that your average person isn't going to be able to afford the same types of legal letters and threatening legal letters that can be sent. If you look at in Alice's case in 2020, when she goes to the literary agency, she gets a very threatening legal letter, and that terrifies her. The one thing I can say is, working for an organisation like the Times, working with the Sunday Times and Dispatches on this, our lawyers have been amazing and have not been intimidated. And we have worked rigorously on this. When, you know, talk about the process, we don't just hear a story from someone and immediately just report that. We go through a series of checks. We've been working on this for a long time. And at the point at which we put allegations to Russell Brand and his representatives, they were incredibly detailed, thoroughly checked allegations that we were satisfied that were very much in the public interest to report.
Have you had anything other than that statement that Russell Brand made to camera in terms of a response? Has there been any detailed answers?
There's been some correspondence with a legal firm that has gone very quiet. They certainly did not address specific allegations. Initially, they tried to demand the identities of the women, which we weren't willing to give up, but we gave them plenty of information that would have made it definitely straightforward for him to know who these women were. So they tried to push back, but they haven't come back with any details. He said in his video that there were some witnesses or some kind of evidence that he has. No one has shared that with us. We have asked for it. We immediately after that video then said, okay, if you have some kind of evidence, please share it with us. And nothing has been sent to us.
I suppose what will be concerning an awful lot of people is, and we've mentioned Jimmy Savile, of course, before, that when we're thinking of this type of predatory behaviour, these allegations of predatory behaviour, you are thinking of a time decades ago, the 70s, the 80s, perhaps even the 90s. These allegations start well into the 21st century, which at the very least suggests that we're perhaps not quite in the right position yet when it comes to power dynamics in the workplace, when it comes to women feeling able to speak out against someone in a more senior role, working in the media, working in any industry for that matter.
Yeah, I think we have come a long way in some regards. You know, you think about the allegations about the junior runner who says she had a sexual relationship with Russell Brand when he was the presenter. And that's very much something in the early 2000s that might have just been seen as something that happens, but that now we recognize there's a huge power imbalance there. And, it makes it very difficult for that runner to report anything that's happened to her, because it'd be very easy for her to lose her job. The presenter's not going to lose his job as quickly as the very junior, very underpaid runner is going to lose her job. So I think that has changed over the last couple of decades. But what hasn't changed is this, the way that some women who and it can be men as well, who feel strong enough to speak about their allegations of serious sexual assaults, the way that people immediately can dismiss them. I think we need to listen to them. Of course, not everyone is going to be telling the truth, and that's why we do vigorous checks. We have done all the work we can to corroborate things. So that's incredibly important. But there is this skepticism still, and I think we have to think about that and why people are so suspicious.
What then, Paul, would you say to those who make the case that actually, if it is impossible to get a fair trial in the court of public opinion, and that the last major investigation of this type of a couple of years ago related to the actor and director Noel Clarke? A number of women came forward and made very, very serious allegations against him. As things stand, there are no criminal proceedings that I understand to be active, and he's looking for £10 million in compensation from The Guardian.
My understanding of reading that story at the time was it's very centred on kind of behaviour at work and claims about women working with him. So there are slight different. There's a bit of those kind of allegations with Russell Brand as well, but there are also allegations just from women who were initially in consensual relationships with him, but who then allege that when they were by themselves with him in a room, they were sexually assaulted. So that's quite different. In terms of kind of the media's role here, I think it's incredibly important. If you live in a society where rape conviction rates are really low, where women are not believed if they come forward about things they say happen to them, about women who don't trust the police for whatever reason, because it's underfunded, because the conviction rates aren't high enough. It's incredibly important that we can tell their stories and hold people in power to account. And if we believe them, if we've done that thorough work, that we have an incredibly important place in society to do that.
We'll let you get back to the work. Paul Morgan-Bentley, great to talk to you. Thanks for being with us. In a moment, with Russell Brand, just the latest high-profile media figure to face accusations of this kind, we'll be asking if the entertainment industry has paid anything but lip service to the Me Too movement. These very serious allegations, of course denied by Russell Brand, only made their way into the public domain after years of work by journalists at The Times, Sunday Times and Channel 4's Dispatches. But they represent just the latest claims made about a powerful industry figure. And as before, those who employed them have almost as many questions to answer. Alice Enders is Head of Research at Enders Analysis. Alice, just what does the BBC, Channel 4, those other independent production companies, what do they have to do now?
What we've seen based on the past is that these companies will undertake an inquiry and will find out whether their workplace guidelines and rules were observed. At the BBC, for example, these allegations concern BBC radio programs and the use of a BBC car, for example, with respect to Alice, one of the accusers. But in the case of Channel 4, of course, it deals with independent production companies. It doesn't produce itself. So it's really the independent production companies that have the onus on them. Now, we have workplace laws and regulations. We also have guidelines, internal guidelines in these production companies, in Channel 4, of course, and the BBC. And so the real question is whether, somehow those processes fell through and the duty of safeguarding, young people, people who work on the show and so on, were observed. The BBC is responsible for the workplace. It serves to everyone who works for it. And then, of course, there's Russell Brand's conduct outside the workplace. And when those two come together, as they have in this particular instance, it's kind of a perfect storm.
As we've been saying all the way through this podcast, make it clear that these are allegations that Russell Brand himself vehemently denies. I mean, how far has the entertainment industry come in dealing with activity, misogyny, sexual assault, that if you rewind 40, 50 years was endemic, apparently? And has the entertainment industry really put its house in order?
It's a work in progress. I think the entertainment industry isn't any different from any other industry in the sense that we have workplace issues mainly affecting women, but also affecting men, particularly young men. There's been a lot of improvement in terms of, for example, internal channels for whistleblowers, for complaints to be raised, including anonymously. I think the broadcasters are obviously writing in conduct requirements in their contracts with freelancers. But to say that takes away the problem would really not be accurate. I mean, we have a wider societal problem around conduct, as we know in the UK. So there's, unfortunately, the entertainment industry isn't at the forefront necessarily of efforts, to clean up the culture of misogyny, sexism, and abuse in the workplace.
Well, indeed. I mean, you think of Harvey Weinstein, his crimes, perhaps the greatest, his proponent of taking advantage of the power imbalance that exists. But what happened after Harvey Weinstein was convicted was that any number of people who had been working in that industry said, look, we knew what he was like. There had been stories circulating about his behaviour for so long. Problem was, of course, is that no one felt emboldened enough to talk about it openly, with a few key and very obvious exceptions, those women who were brave enough to talk about it. I mean, does the entertainment industry pay anything other than lip service to the Me Too movement?
We're dealing here with a culture that's evolving. What is acceptable language has evolved, and the way in which people see the workplace has evolved. There's a merit here in the sense that the entertainment industry is looking at itself closely. And I think we have a level of disclosure in the entertainment industry, thanks to the media and so on, which is much higher than that in other industries. You know, in the UK, we have thousands of workplace complaints every single year about inappropriate behavior, and they don't get reported in the media. But when it affects a celebrity, they do. And I think partly it's because we have given these celebrities an iconic status in our society, and we have high expectations for them. But it's also true in the corporate world. People who are at the top of the heap, if you like, they have a very special responsibility with respect to their conduct in the workplace. All across the corporate world, this power imbalance has existed for years, decades, and has been, unfortunately, to the detriment of particularly women in the workplace.
And that's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We will see you next time.